Today, we're going to look at how the CIA maps the world. In particular, we're going to look at this map, the CIA World Political Map from 2019. And the main question I'm asking here is, are we seduced by this map? What I mean by that is, does this map give us an unrealistic view of the world? The map gives us a political vision, basically a vision of how the world ought to be organized, at least according to the global community, the US Department of State. But it masquerades as a descriptive map of how the world is actually organized. We can see the difference between these two ways of mapping by looking at a close-up of the CIA's map of the Black Sea region. We see here clean boundaries and clear territories. Actually, it's a much more complicated situation. What we find are breakaway states, Russian annexation, and, to be frank, quite a geopolitical mess in many areas. Let's start by looking at the boundary between Moldova and Ukraine. What we find here is a breakaway state called Transnistria, which has been effectively independent since 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, sometimes regarded almost as a gangster state. Sometimes it's regarded as a Russian client state, but it certainly is not part of Moldova, which the CIA map shows it as part of. If we move over toward the east, we'll see the breakaway People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk. These were areas that broke off from Ukraine in 2014 with Russian-oriented separatists taking power. Again, they're often regarded as Russian client states, but they're certainly not part of Ukraine. Moving down to the east and the south, in Georgia, we can see the breakaway Republic of Abkhazia. That emerged in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. Georgia became independent, but the people of Abkhazia declared themselves independent. Again, it's often seen as something of a client state of Russia. There's another very similar thing a little bit further to the east in Georgia, which is the Republic of South Ossetia. Effectively independent, but often regarded as a client or puppet of Russia. Again, moving a little bit more to the south and east in Azerbaijan, we can see the Republic of Artsakh, or Nagorno-Karabakh as it's often called. This is a largely Armenian populated area that declared itself independent from Azerbaijan, again in 1991, and functions essentially as a client state of Armenia with Russian support. And if you look at near the center of the map, you'll see the Crimean Peninsula mapped as part of Ukraine. But in actuality, that was annexed by Russia in 2014. Now, that annexation is not regarded as legitimate by the global community, but it seems quite unlikely that Russia is going to give that territory up anytime soon, or perhaps ever. So there are some problems with this map, but before going into these problems, I do want to note that this is a very useful map and a very handsome map as well. It's often updated, it's constantly evolving. It's a sort of map that a geographer or anyone who wants to be aware of the world should consult frequently. We can find, for example, renamed countries. Looking at the center of the map, we see that what used to be the Czech Republic is now Czechia. The country did not want to go without a proper name. Looking a little bit to the south and to the east, we can see that Macedonia is now Northern Macedonia. It changed its name to get support from Greece because Greece has its own area of Macedonia. And there are still many people in Greece who object to the use of the name Northern Macedonia for this country, but the Greek government does accept it. We see renamed cities as well. The capital of Kazakhstan, Nur-Sultan, formerly Astana, named after the former president of the country. It's not the first time the city's name has changed. It's gone through many different permutations over the years. And it's an important city. I think everyone should be aware of it. It is a new city and quite a grandiose city, reflecting Kazakhstan's oil wealth and its powerful authoritarian government as well. What I'm going to do, though, for the rest of the lecture is analyze this map. And I'm going to critique it, again, admitting that it's a very useful map, but it has some problems. The way I'll do this is first by analyzing how the map depicts geopolitical organization. And I'll do that through analyzing its visual language or cartographic conventions. And then I'll look at the kind of vision that I think it conveys, and that would be the vision of the global community of nations. After doing this, I'll show where the map betrays that vision. It does it does this through several different ways. One, there are unmarked deviations from that vision. They're just not acknowledged, but they're there on the map. And then there are a number of places where it marks exceptions to its norms of conceptualization of the global community. And then finally, I'll briefly talk about what this all means. The CIA world map shows a two-level geopolitical hierarchy, dominated by independent states or independent countries, sovereign states, if you will, and as a second level, their dependencies, territories usually overseas that are not independent but are controlled by another country. We can see this in the very minimal key, and I've enlarged the key so that we can read it more clearly. So we see independent states are in all capital letters. Dependencies are written as normal proper nouns. Islands and island groups are in italics. And then we just have two kinds of capitals: national capitals, capitals of sovereign states, in other words, and other capitals, those of dependencies. I've added a few things to this legend to make it a little bit more complete. Dependencies also have the controlling country labeled, often abbreviated, but in parentheses. And as I just mentioned, national capitals are capitals of independent states, and other capitals are those of dependencies. The only real dependency we can see easily on the map from this distance is Greenland. So let's focus in a little bit more. We can see Greenland written here as a regular proper noun with its sovereign state that has ultimate control, Denmark, in parentheses. We can see its capital city as a hollow star rather than a solid star. And on the same map, we can see several other dependencies: Svalbard, a dependency of Norway, and another dependency of Denmark, the Faroe Islands. Almost all other dependencies are really too small to be seen unless you really have a close-up view of this map. At this scale or distance, it's hard to see them. And they may seem insignificant because of their small size. Most of them are islands. I would argue, though, that they're not insignificant, partly because they control a tremendous amount of sea space. According to the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, any sovereign state or any dependency of any sovereign state has complete economic control over all resources within 200 nautical miles of the shore, unless there's another interceding state, and then you simply split the difference. So you can see a number of European countries, well, including the United States, Western countries, have substantial overseas territories, oceanic economic zones that they control through their dependencies. And then if we just add in the countries that control these dependencies, we can see it is a fairly large percentage of the entire world, including water as well as land. It's just an aside. I want to note that some dependencies some non-dependencies are actually mapped as dependencies. That's not a big issue, but I'll draw your attention to it. Jan Mayen, for example, is an uninhabited Norwegian island that is supposedly an integral part of Norway. It's not really a dependency. And then there's this odd feature here, Rockall, mapped as a dependency, as a British dependency, but it's actually a rock. It's not even an island, and British control is contested by neighboring countries. This is significant for a couple of reasons. The UN Convention of the Law of the Sea does distinguish an island, which is something that at least potentially could be inhabited, from a rock which can't be inhabited. And Rockall is often washed over by waves, certainly far from inhabitable. And you can see the significance here in that the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea does not give an economic zone around a rock. We have on the map on the right, you can see the United Kingdom's exclusive economic zone. I put Rockall in there. And if Rockall were an island, that exclusive economic zone would be considerably larger, something like that. Anyway, getting back to our main themes. What does this map convey? It conveys a global model based on clear and clean boundaries between countries, one of uncontested territorial sovereignty, with just a few little exceptions. On this map, virtually all land is depicted as falling under a named sovereign power. It's complete division of the world, essentially a kind of global jigsaw puzzle, if you will. It conveys what I would think of as a model of the world that might be described as the global community of nations, which underpins the entire viewpoint of the United Nations. That there are a set number of independent states, 193 members of the United Nations to be precise, which come together as quasi-equal states, as persons in the international community, if you will, and together form the global community with their dependencies in tow. If you compare the CIA world map to the UN world political map below, you can find they're almost identical. Now, there are some exceptions, and I'll go through some of the most important exceptions, but basically this is the same vision of the world. We can see that how close it is by looking at the mapping of even minuscule and insignificant islands. Kargados Karahosh Shoals, for example, in the Indian Ocean. It's 500 acres of sand that's occasionally washed over by the waves. Not significant at all. But both the CIA world political map and the UN map show this insignificant territory, whereas they leave off many much more important islands. You see the mapping is just almost the same. But what's more important is to look at where the CIA map sort of betrays this vision of the global political community. And it does so in several ways. One is what I would call unmarked deviations. We'll see, for example, there's one territory that's mapped without sovereignty. There are two important deviations between the UN depiction of sovereignty and the CIA depiction of sovereignty. So that's important to note. And then on the CIA map, there are a number of marked deviations. 8 territorial conflicts are shown and 3 geopolitical irregularities, as well as a few other ambiguities. So I'm going to spend the rest of the lecture analyzing and describing how these deviations are or are not portrayed and what that may mean to the vision of the world. The most glaring exception is, to this notion that the world community is composed of nation states and their dependencies is one that's found on both the CIA and the UN map, and that's Western Sahara, a territory in the west of Africa on the Atlantic seaboard. If you look at the CIA map more closely, you can see that Western Sahara is depicted as a dependency. It's a clearly bounded, colored territory labeled as a regular proper noun, not as a state. If it were mapped as a state, it would be in all capital letters. But unlike all other map dependencies here, there's no sovereign state in parentheses underneath it. Nor does the color match any country that might conceivably be regarded as the sovereign state controlling Western Sahara. If the CIA were to actually map the real condition, the actual situation in Western Sahara, would see something very different. We would see that most of the territory has been annexed by Morocco, and Morocco regards this as integral to its territory, and it fully controls it. Morocco took it over when the Spanish colonialists left in 1975. The international community has never accepted that annexation, but it is a fact on the ground, and it looks very unlikely that Western Sahara will ever emerge as any sort of a state. There is, however, what we might call an aspirational state here. It's not Western Sahara, it's the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, supposedly. It controls a little bit of land here. Morocco has a heavily fortified series of sand berms separating it from this area that it considers sort of no man's land. But there's a few thousand people living here, and you have this would-be state that has been recognized by a number of members of the United Nations, but not by the United States, and it's certainly not a member of the United Nations. It is, as I said, an aspirational state that doesn't really have the quality of existence. Anyway, the CIA and the UN have pretty much the same depiction of Western Sahara. There are several places on the map where the CIA and the UN deviate quite markedly in their depiction of sovereignty. So let's look on the left first at the CIA world map. A little bit south and east of center, we can see the independent state of Kosovo, which is actually a functioning independent state and is recognized as such by the United States. The UN, however, regards this area as part of Serbia, as an illegitimate area the area that illegitimately declared its own independence in 2008. So if the UN were to map Kosovo, it would be as I've shown it right there. But instead, this is just shown as part of Serbia. The United Nations rejects Kosovo's existence, partly because Serbia rejects it, and both China and Russia follow suit, and because they are permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations, are able to veto Kosovo's bid to enter this. So very different depiction here. There's also a very different depiction of one particular dependency, and that is the Chagos Archipelago, or the British Indian Ocean Territory. You can see on the CIA map that it is mapped as a dependency of the United Kingdom, which is the actual situation here. On the UN map, however, the Chagos Archipelago is mapped as part of the independent country of Mauritius. The reason for the significance of this area is one island in the Chagos Archipelago, which is Diego Garcia, which has been leased by the United Kingdom to the United States and is a bulwark of US power in the Indian Ocean, heavily militarized island from which military flights go all the way to Afghanistan and beyond. This is something that the United Nations rejects. Actually, when Diego Garcia was turned into a US military base, the people living there were rounded up and deported to Mauritius. They are not at all happy about that. They've been demanding to return, and the United Nations has ruled that they must be allowed to return and that the entire archipelago needs to be turned over to Mauritius. The United Kingdom is not about to do that, nor is the United States going to go along with that. So this is an impasse between the United States and the United Kingdom on one hand, and the United Nations on the other. So those are the unmarked deviations. Let's look now at where the map actually marks differences between how it maps and the underlying vision. And I'll go through these one by one. So one would be the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is not a case of clear-cut boundaries and blanket sovereignty, obviously. Another would be the Kashmir dispute between India and Pakistan, and to a certain extent between China as well. The never concluded Korean War is marked by an irregular boundary, which is not considered a permanent boundary by any means. I've put those in larger circles because those are particularly important conflicts. Not quite as important is the conflict between Japan and Russia over the Southern Kuril Islands, or the Falkland-Malvinas dispute between the United Kingdom and Argentina. And then we have even less significant disputes: the Halayib Triangle disputed between Egypt and Sudan, the Elimi Triangle disputed between South Sudan and Kenya, the provisional boundary between Ethiopia and Somalia. That sort of rounds out these border disputes. In green, I've put some geopolitical irregularities. A very important one is the position of Hong Kong and Macau. Antarctica is significant as well. And then arguably we have another one in the southern Indian Ocean. It's not exactly a geopolitical irregularity, but it is certainly marked on the map. We'll get to that in a second. These disputes and irregularities are shown in two different ways. One is through text and the other is through graphics. And in text, we can differentiate labels on the map from notes on the map. By notes, I mean full sentences explaining something. And then graphics, we have lines, which are essentially borders, and colors that show sovereignty over different areas. So let's look at how this actually works out in practice. We have several examples where the CIA labels both territorial control and territorial claims. So you can see both the Falkland or Malvinas Islands, and then to the east of that, South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands. These are both controlled by the United Kingdom and are both claimed by Argentina. The same kind of mapping convention is followed in the South Kuril Islands dispute. You can see that they're administered by Russia or controlled by Russia, claimed by Japan. We get a little historical detail thrown in here as well. I would note as an aside that there are other very heated territorial disputes in the same region that are ignored. The Dokdo Takeshima dispute between Japan and South Korea, the Sengaku Islands controlled by Japan, claimed by China. A lot of saber rattling over the latter category in particular. The former prevents easy relationships between South Korea and Japan, among many other issues as well. So these are significant, but I just want to note that they're not on the map. Another part of the world here in the Kashmir dispute, we can see that the map is showing both claims and control, but it's doing it a little bit differently. It's doing it separately. It's showing a line of actual control. Anything to the north or east of that line is controlled by China. And then it's noting that there's an Indian claim in the label as well. The other side of the same dispute is quite different. Here we're just showing control. We have the line of control separating what India actually controls from what Pakistan actually controls, but the map isn't showing any claims beyond that. And certainly both India and Pakistan have major claims on the other side of that line of control. And as an aside, I'm quite curious as what the difference might be between a line of control and a line of actual control, but that's not explained anywhere. There are also labels for border irregularities. You can see here between Egypt and Sudan, there's an administrative border. Between Ethiopia and Somalia, there's a provisional administrative line. And between North and South Korea, there's a military demarcation line. So these are just border disputes. They vary in their intensity and how they were created, but they're all borders that have dispute in one way or another. And then finally in labeling, we can look at labeling of geopolitical irregularities. And what I'm talking about here are Macau and Hong Kong. These are the only places on the map where we have a label that's actually describing a mode of administration. Otherwise, it's just an independent state in those all capital letters or a dependency. But here we have something that's a little bit different and it's noted in the label. If we can add in the key to this map, we can get a sense of how these are being classified. You could see at the second level here in the key, we have dependency or areas of special sovereignty. Everything else noted with this kind of regular proper noun is a dependency, but Hong Kong and Macau are different. These are areas of special sovereignty. This isn't described in the map or in any materials pertaining to the map. It's something that one just sort of has to piece together. This is an official category with the US Department of State. Interestingly, Hong Kong and Macau are not the only areas of special sovereignty recognized by the US Department of State, but they're the only ones mapped here. On Cyprus, for example, there are 2 British sovereign military bases. In the CIA World Factbook, a different source of cartographic information actually notes that it's the United Kingdom area of special sovereignty. But on the CIA World Map and on its Middle Eastern map, these areas are not indicated. There's also one note on geopolitical irregularity, and that has to do with the anomalous position of Antarctica, which is described. But I would note neither described neither directly nor correctly. By directly, I mean this is a very roundabout way of describing it, with 21 of 28 Antarctic consultative countries having made no claims. It would be much more direct to talk about the countries that have made claims, but putting it this way emphasizes more the harmony of the global community of nations. If you were to emphasize countries that have claims, the harmony is sort of undermined. And it's not correct because we see here it notes 28 Antarctic consultative countries, and actually there are now 29. 2014, Czechia was upgraded in its status here, and that just simply has not been noted on the CIA map, which was made in 2019, by the way. And if we want to see the actual Antarctic claims, here's a map showing them. Note that a number of them are overlapping, so it's a very complex situation. And then finally, there's this a note, and it actually uses the term note describing the French southern and Antarctic lands, essentially uninhabited lands in the South Indian Ocean and around Madagascar. It seems to me this is simply done to avoid having to mark French control for each separate island. So I'm calling this a note on cartographic convenience. As an aside, it's interesting that there are two French overseas departments, integral parts of France, that are mapped accurately here, but no attention is drawn to them. And then as another aside, I'd note that there are many actual territorial disputes in this region that are not shown at all. This is a map just showing territorial disputes. Every arrow there indicates a dispute between one country and another over small islands in general and the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone that comes along with them. Now let's move on to graphic depictions. Lines showing borders, colors showing sovereignty. I'll be going over all of the territorial disputes here. We've seen some of them before. We'll see some of them again in several different slides because they're marked in many different ways or in separate ways. For example, these disputes we've all seen before, Ethiopia and Somalia, India and Pakistan and Kashmir, North and South Korea. We have dashed lines showing that the boundaries between them are provisional in one way or another. They're not accepted and they're not, made permanent in the eyes of the international community. We also have dashed lines that do something quite differently, that don't just mark off one country from another, but enclose or surround a disputed territory. So we see the India-China dispute in the Kashmir region. The dashed line is used very differently. It goes all the way around Aksai Chin, this area that is controlled by China. It was part of India until 1962 and is still claimed by India. Similarly, the dispute between Israel and the Palestinian territories, the West Bank and Gaza, we have dashed line encircling the West Bank and another dashed line encircling Gaza, although Gaza is so small, it's somewhat difficult to make out what's going on here. As an aside, I would note that the Golan Heights, which the international community does not regard as part of Israel, but was annexed by Israel, and just within the last year, that annexation has been accepted by the United States. And so the CIA is now mapping the Golan Heights as an undisputed part of Israel. Some other territorial disputes are shown with a combination of a dashed and a solid line, which again encloses territory. So the Halayib Triangle between Egypt and Sudan, we have a solid white line. That was the original sort of just straightforward surveyed boundary. We see the same thing in the Elimi Triangle, which is disputed between Kenya and South Sudan. These both came into being through the convenience of the British Empire, essentially. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, Egypt was a de facto British colony, although it was nominally independent. Sudan was actually an Anglo-Egyptian colony, a condominium, if you will. But since Egypt was a de facto British colony, they basically were both under British control. And Britain first just surveyed a straight line and then made an administrative boundary sort of for ease of colonial management. And the same thing happened between what had been the Anglo-Egyptian condominium of Sudan before it separated into South Sudan and Kenya. Again, these were both British territories. We had a surveyed line, and then for administrative convenience, we had a separate administrative boundary. When these countries became independent, these disputes just sort of carried on and are still existent to this day. As far as color goes, we find some very interesting things. There's only one place on the map that shows dual coloration, and that is Aksai Chin, this area that is claimed by India and was under Indian control until 1962, was taken over by China after a war between China and India in that year. So it is showing through this, these diagonal lines a territorial dispute, but that's not done anywhere else in the world. In the Elimi Triangle, we have something very similar. we're using solid colors to show both claiming and controlling countries, but in a different way. The entire area is under the control of Kenya, but yet in the western part of it, it's colored with the color of Kenya. In the eastern part, it's colored with the color of South Sudan. So we're using sort of both colors here. In other parts of the world, we have a single color to indicate the controlling country only. So the Falkland or Malvinas Islands, South Georgia, and the South Sandwich Islands as well are colored with the color of the United Kingdom, just to show you in close-up that the same color is used here. This is also done with the India-Pakistan conflict. So the area controlled by India is given the color of India. The area controlled by Pakistan is given the color of Pakistan. Quite straightforward. But we find the opposite situation in the Japan-Russia conflict over the Kuril Islands. These are controlled by Russia, claimed by Japan, but colored as if they were part of Japan. And we find the same thing here with the Al-Ayab Triangle. It's controlled by Egypt, but we have it colored as if it were part of the claiming country, which would be Sudan. There's also a very interesting thing here, which is a small area, Bir Tawal, which is the color indicates neither the controlling nor the claiming country. The map is showing it as basically Egyptian by color, but Egypt does not control it and does not claim it. Neither does Sudan. And the situation is that Egypt is claiming that surveyed straight line. Sudan is claiming the administrative line. That means Bir Tawal is terra nullius. No country claims it. No country controls it. And as an aside, there are periodically adventurous people who go to Bir Tawal and claim it as their own sovereign state. It's essentially uninhabited. And so, of course, that's just basically a stunt. It's more complicated here in the situation of Israel and the Palestinian territories. I just note that the Palestinian territories have their own distinctive color. Palestinian territories are not a sovereign state. They're there are areas under quasi-sovereignty, we might say, but there are huge disputes over the territorial boundaries. I'm not going to go into the details here. I would note, though, that the Palestinian territories are the only areas that are bounded and colored distinctly, but yet have neither a name nor a capital on the map. So they're mapped in a different manner than any other place. A few other additional ambiguities and contradictions are worth noting on things like label font and color, and contradictions between the world map and the regional maps, which go along with the world map, and an issue in mapping of islands as well. The most important of these ambiguities has to do with the status of Taiwan. If you look at how Taiwan is labeled, you could see that it is labeled as an island. You can see the italics used here. You can see that it is not in all caps, which means that it's not being mapped as any sort of sovereign state. And the color both of Taiwan itself and of its label match that of China, both the territory of China and the label of China. So we're basically, CIA is mapping Taiwan merely as an island of China. And that is how it is seen by the US Department of State officially in de jure terms, but not de facto terms, because the United States certainly under the table recognizes Taiwan as a sovereign state, but it doesn't do so officially because it has to follow the one China line of the People's Republic of China. But then I draw your attention to another Chinese island, which is actually an island totally controlled by China in the far western part of that map, Hainan, and note that they are labeled very differently. Taiwan is in a bold font, Hainan is not. Hainan, the font for Hainan does not have the same color as China. And I'm not sure what this means, if it means anything. But if the CIA were to map Taiwan just like Hainan as an island of China, they could either do it like this, or they could do it like this, having the same sort of label, but they don't, and I'm not sure why that is. There are some interesting discrepancies between the world map here and the regional maps that go along with it. Let's look at the world map showing this area between the African mainland and Madagascar. We have an independent country, the Comoros, several islands, and then we have a French overseas department, as much part of France as Hawaii is part of the United States. And on the 2019 CIA world map, it is mapped as an undisputed and integral part of France. Note France is not in parentheses here. It is simply France. But if you look at the Africa map, you can see a very different vision. Here it is mapped not only as a dependency of France, notice the parentheses, but also the territorial dispute, which does exist, Comoros does claim this island, that is noted as well. And this was the way the CIA world map formerly depicted it. Administered by France, claimed by Comoros as a French dependency. So the question I come away with this is, does or does not the CIA recognize Mayotte as an integral part of France? It's unclear. Previous CIA world maps did the same thing in the Caribbean. So French Guiana, Martinique, and Guadeloupe are all integral parts of France. Hence the parentheses here are misleading, whereas Saint Martin and Saint Bart's are French dependencies, hence the parentheses are appropriate. So the New World Map is an improvement on this score, or at least it is reflecting more the actual situation on the ground. Another inconsistency here is these regional maps will generally give more detail, except when they don't. And it's interesting here, if we look at the world map of Spain, southern Portugal, Morocco, you could see there are several integral parts of Spain. They're not dependencies, but they're on the Moroccan mainland, Ceuta and Melilla. And then also we have a British dependency, note the parentheses, which is Gibraltar. They're both shown on the world map, but on the Africa map, they're not shown. So that's simply an oddity. And then finally, an interesting inconsistency. I don't know if it means anything, but lots of islands on the CIA world map for the first time, it wasn't true in previous maps, but now have these sort of circles of sovereignty, which are colored to match the sovereign country. So you could see the Northern Marianas and Guam are dependencies of the United States. Many of them are really too small to see on the map, or you can barely see them. You couldn't really tell the color, so they have this circle around them that are colored appropriately. But yet there are many other islands that don't get the same treatment, and it doesn't have to do with size. You can see Guam is significantly larger than little Nicobar Island, but Guam gets the sovereignty circle and little Nicobar doesn't. Is this significant? I'm not sure. Anyway, let's move on to our conclusions. How does the CIA map the world? It admits that there are disputes, but they're shown as relatively insignificant and quite simple. And the disputes that we see are only the ones that are acknowledged by the international community. Many very important disputes, like the ones I mentioned at the beginning, simply are not mapped at all. They're not acknowledged. The UN global model is strictly followed, except where the US State Department explicitly disagrees with the UN. And that would be over issues like the situation of Kosovo, the Chagos Archipelago, the Golan Heights, would be the main ones. There are a few other minor ones, but those are the significant ones. So the UN gives the model of the global community of states, or of nations, but the US State Department and the CIA give themselves sort of the right to disagree with that when it's of particular interest to the United States. If we compare the way the CIA and the UN map territorial disputes, we can see there's a huge amount of overlap. So the red circles here show territorial disputes that we see both on the CIA world map and on the United Nations world map. There are a couple of green ones, well, two in particular. That would be the Kuril Islands. And in the South Atlantic, the South Georgia dispute, not the Falkland dispute, but just the South Georgia dispute. And then there are a couple that are only on the UN map, the border between Sudan and South Sudan, and an area in the eastern part of India that's disputed with China. It's the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh. China calls it South Tibet. There'll be a separate map lecture given later on the UN map of the world, which will show these kinds of depictions on that UN map. The take-home message from all of this, Well, one is I would say that the cartographic portrayal of territorial disputes and geopolitical irregularities is not deemed as particularly important. Uh, we don't have a complete key to the map, just a very sort of skeletal key. We don't have any consistency of depiction, seen as unnecessary. There are no real explanatory notes, except perhaps that on Antarctica, and that's a very vague note. There's no textual description of the mapping project, how it's organized, who's responsible for it, how it works. It is simply given as a map. The most important implication, I think, is the implication that the world is a highly ordered, structured place, built around cooperating nation states that all fully control their territorial extents, just a few minor exceptions. This is, I think, a seductive but fundamentally misleading depiction of geopolitical reality, because actual geopolitics are much more complex, much messier. And I think it's potentially at least a dangerous vision because it generates unrealistic expectations of stability, or at least it potentially could. For example, if we look at the 2003 Iraq War and look at the original projections by the Bush administration, that it would cost $50 to $60 billion, that it would last weeks, not months. In actuality, it's cost something between $3 and $6 trillion. It's lasted for years, not weeks. Now, I'm not suggesting that these mistaken predictions about the war were all generated from this map, but I think this map and other maps like it and the whole vision of the world that inform this map are misleading. And it's important to have that vision to understand diplomatic views of how the world should be put together, but it's equally important to see how the world is actually put together. And I would note too, there were very similar predictions about the Arab Spring, that if the people of Yemen could rise up and overthrow their government, that Yemen could turn the corner to democracy and stability. That obviously hasn't happened, nothing like it. Why? Well, because Yemen was not a nation state as portrayed by this map. It never really functioned the way the map pictures it as functioning. Anyway, this is just one view of a much larger project. If you want a more complete exposition, I would recommend you look at Seduced by the Map, The Geography of State, Nation, and Sovereignty. This is an open access extended ebook available freely online, written by myself and by Karen Wiggett. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this map lecture. Thank you.